We begin with a chant of Om together 5 times. We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's synthesis of yoga for almost now, I think, 17 years when we began here at Savitri Bhavan. And we took up successively in sequence the first few chapters of the introduction, followed by a going straight to the yoga of self-perfection, which is the framework of the integral yoga proper. And then we came back to studying the other three, the yoga of works, the yoga of knowledge, and the yoga of love. Beginning with the yoga of knowledge, because it is the point where our human mind can learn to enter into right relation with the self, with the divine. In a sense, the yoga of works and the yoga of love both rest on the development of our consciousness. And when we speak of our consciousness, what we are conscious of is our mind. When we say, I'm conscious of the sensations of the body, what are you conscious of? The sensations as registered in the mind. When you're conscious of your emotions, you're conscious of the emotions as registered in the mind. And so in a way, this forms a kind of a foundation in the basic relationship of our awareness with the divine, which then can turn into the works or through the movement of the devotion to form the basis of the triple path, all of which act as a foundation for the integral yoga proper. When Sri Aurobindo describes the yoga of knowledge, he does not take it merely in the traditional framework of the yoga of knowledge. He broadens the scope by naming it also as the yoga of integral knowledge. And so the entire approach is meant to be as necessary for the practice of the integral yoga as a foundation. In this, you will find step by step through the chapters that we have already studied, he describes the requirements in the practice, the internal preparation of our power of concentration, the requirements of the external discipline in the practice. And now we come to the core of the difficulties of the mental being, and this is the theme of the chapter. The name of the chapter is The Difficulties of the Mental Being. When thus our mind, through a power of concentration, wants to turn to relate to the divine, how are we to know the divine? What are the different modalities, the ways in which one perceives the divine? All of this has been discussed in the previous chapters. And in summarizing that discussion, he says at the beginning of this chapter, we have come to this stage in our development of the path of knowledge that we began by affirming the realization of our pure self, pure existence, above the terms of mind, life, and body, as the first object of this yoga. But we now affirm that this is not sufficient, and that we must also realize the self or Brahman in its essential modes and primarily in its triune reality as Satchidananda. Not only pure existence, but pure consciousness and pure bliss of its being and consciousness are the reality of the self and the essence of the Brahman. And so here comes a major distinction from the traditional approach of the path of knowledge to the integral knowledge and the integral yoga, that we must know the divine in the way the divine knows himself. It is not enough to know the divine in an aspect, in a part, but you must be in entirety in the realization. And the means for that, the means by which all the different aspects of the divine can be experienced in one single whole, is to know the divine in its essential as Satchidananda. And this was part of an entire chapter earlier, which he has just summarized in a single line. And then he says, even in realizing the Satchidananda, there are two kinds of realization. The first, which is a kind of a silent, passive, quietistic, where you are immersed in the Satchidananda, aloof from the world. And a second, in which that same consciousness now flows freely as the Lord of things, from that poise of calm flows out to master the whole world as its own force, its own consciousness, its own being, while remaining all the time free in its silence. It is also master and masterfully engaged with the whole world. And it is this, he says, which is the object of the realization for the sadhaka of the integral yoga. And this he distinguishes from the conventional, traditional ideas of the divine being that we have in various religions. This is not the God of the religions, because this poise includes both the equality and the freedom, as well as the immanence and the mastery. Both are included in this poise, which he describes as the transcendent, possessing the whole creation. From this, we now move to the actual means by which the mind can thus enter in relation with the Satchidananda. And so this chapter becomes as if the core of the entire practice. It contains, in essence, all that is required for us to overcome the veil which separates us from the divine. He points out that if we were simply already living as supra-mental beings, then we would experience this directly. But we are, first of all, mental beings, and not yet supramental. But as mental beings, we can only know through mind whatever we wish to know. And so when the mind turns to realize the divine, it experiences certain difficulties. First, the difficulty is that the mind is fundamentally the opposite of the divine consciousness, and there is a huge gulf in between. He describes in a longish paragraph, step by step, how the mind, its working, its consciousness is opposite of the Sat, opposite of the Chit, opposite of the Ananda, opposite of the supramental knowledge which belongs to the Satchidananda, and in every way the very opposite. And so, in the meeting between these two, what can you expect? When two opposite things meet, you will not find continuity, you will only find gap. If the two were related to each other, you might find continuity, but when they're opposite of each other, you find only a gap. And so he says, when therefore the mental being seeks to know the divine, to realize it, to become it, it has first to lift this lid, to put by this veil. And when it succeeds in doing this, then it experiences the divine, but still with the sense of a gap. The divine is everywhere. You experience the presence, this infinite consciousness, this infinite being, this infinite delight. But when you come out of that immersion in the divine, you find it recedes, it goes away, you lose it. Your mind is unable to retain that experience when it is left to itself. And he says, somehow this chasm has to be bridged. And how to bridge this is the theme that we have been discussing the last two classes. And he describes two possibilities for the mental being. And we have gone in great detail in these two already. For those of you who are interested, it will be worthwhile to review the last three classes which are available online. But briefly, to summarize some key points, and these are the practices that we have all to develop in our life, by which the mind can be helped to grow in closeness and can grow in familiarity until eventually it can grow in the image of the divine consciousness. So the first of these possibilities is to rise by a great, prolonged, concentrated, all-forgetting effort out of itself into the Supreme. The mind has to as if leave its own consciousness and disappear into another. Now, in principle, this is what we are doing every time we daydream. Except the daydream is not turned towards the divine, it is turned to something else in the human or sensory experience. When you watch a person sitting in daydream, you will notice that the eyes don't blink, or if somebody passes by, he does not notice. When the daydream becomes very deep, you might even forget that you're hungry or that you're thirsty. You might forget things which are around you. If there is danger, the danger is forgotten. When you come back from the daydream, it is as if you have come from a great distance in terms of consciousness, in terms of time, even in terms of space. You have a gap. You might find, for example, that in your daydream, when you return, you feel as if hours have passed, and you look at your watch and perhaps 10 minutes have passed. There is a gap even in the sense of time. Or the reverse. You might feel you were in daydream for a few minutes and you look at the watch and an hour has passed. Or you have the sense of having gone far away and come back. If you're called back in a shock and someone says, "What were you daydreaming about?" And you say, "Oh, I don't know. I've forgotten." The nature of the shock is such that it cut off the memory of the experience. And I'm giving this great importance to show that in principle, this capacity to enter in immersed concentration already belongs to us. It is not something which is outside our capacity. It is something very much within reach. The difference between the daydream and this concentration required to enter in relation with the divine is only the direction in which you turn your attention and your daydream. If the same daydream was turned in immersion to the divine, you would have reached something concrete which would remain, and a familiarity and an entry in the divine consciousness would have begun. How would we do that? One can begin in many ways, following the same pattern of our daydream. We turn in daydream normally in an idle mind, but to something which we find interesting, which we find attractive. Often it may be a call of the emotions, sometimes it is your thoughts, but exactly the same process, you turn to the divine. You dwell upon a memory, perhaps, a memory of something beautiful, an experience of closeness we have had, something beautiful you have read, a beautiful idea that has touched you, or an image of the divine, or a turning of your heart in love, in devotion, or just in a sense of intimacy, of closeness. And you turn consciously in this way to the divine with your mind, with your heart, with your awareness, and begin to dwell upon that. And as you dwell upon it, you will find the sense of closeness begins to grow. As that grows, you let your immersion dwell deeper and make it more exclusive, more immersed, more one-pointed, letting all else fade out. We discover in such a practice that our power of concentration has two facets. One is the power of concentration to turn towards what we want to know, and the other is the power of concentration to withdraw from all else. In a way, both of these are to be exercised. You withdraw from everything else, let the whole world fade away, nothing matters anymore. This is the one thing which matters. If it helps, you place before you a visual focal point, a center, an object. As, for example, when you sit in the Matri Mandir, the crystal in the center might be the visual focal point. Or if you sit in the gardens, the Matri Mandir itself could be a focal point. If you lie down on your terrace, the focal point is the vastness of the sky. Whatever it is that for you becomes a reference is a starting point only. And as you thus begin to dwell and lose yourself in that immersion, your eyes may close and you let it happen. Or they may remain open, but the visual center now fades out in the concentration of the experience on which you're dwelling. And you dwell on that and let it grow. In the discussion Sri Aurobindo has here, you will see he gives all the keys. Great, prolonged, concentrated, all-forgetting effort. You forget everything, including yourself, in that immersion. And the result is a kind of a state of trance, however partial, does not matter. But in which your mind, your consciousness, leaning in, losing itself, forgetting itself, for a while goes beyond its limitation. For a while remains immersed in something which is not itself, which belongs properly to the divine consciousness. In the traditional approach of the yoga of knowledge, one would develop special practices, one would go through special practices to develop this capacity of immersion in trance. But for us, it is not so necessary at this stage. Rather, simply the dwelling and immersion in the heart and the mind would be enough to take us deep enough. Sri Aurobindo then discusses the limitation of the common logic of this experience. The common logic would be that, well, you have to enter a trance state. When you come back, you discover you're still full of pretty much the same habits of your mind, of your nature. And so you must progressively withdraw from your nature until you merge in the trance state and you drop off the body. And then you have merged in the divine. But he says, actually, that's not so true. Because remember, we are not body. We are much more our psychology. We are much more our mind. Shedding the body changes nothing. We still remain as mental beings, even after the body is shed. And if that mind is not participating in this experience, then it's not really doing what we want. So the goal, he says, is not just being able to rise out into some deeper or higher diviner state, but there is a requirement for the waking mentality to be entirely spiritualized. And unless it is spiritualized, this experience in a higher state of consciousness cannot continue into your life. And the moment we recognize that, yes, your waking mental consciousness needs to be spiritualized, it opens us to a second possibility. And this second possibility is spiritualizing the mind itself by invoking the divine consciousness into it. And so we find two approaches. One in which the mind loses itself into a higher state, and the other is that the higher state is called down into the mind. And the two are complementary. And this was the theme of, I think, the last class, where, I think the last two classes, where Sri Aurobindo first describes how this is to be done. How is the mind to receive something which is so totally different from it? And he points out that if you observe the working of your mind, actually, the power of the mind, the essential power of the mind, is of reflecting. When the mind becomes very quiet, it can be turned to reflect anything. But when it is not quiet in our normal state of activity, the mind is a reflector of our normal nature, normal activities, and particularly of the senses and the world around. Notice that when you look around you, you observe, there's a flower, this is red colored, this is beautiful. And all this information of the senses which is pouring into you, the mind itself does not reach out to grab. The senses are functioning. They're only feeding in all this. The mind registers only. The mind essentially, he says, is a reflector and a medium, and none of its activities originate in themselves. And this is a question of introspection, which we have dwelt upon in detail in those classes. But briefly, in summarizing, we observe that finally everything we know comes into us from outside, and we know it only when it reflects in the mental consciousness. And once we recognize this great truth of the mind, we realize also that as a reflector, it can be consciously made quiet so that the reflection is not distorted. Otherwise, when the mind is agitated, the same image coming in would also be warped. The classic example is, as you're walking late at night, you see a rope on the floor. If you're disturbed in your emotions, then you will see the rope moving and you'll see, it's a snake. But that's only because the mirror reflecting is itself distorted. But when the mind is taught to be very quiet, it reflects passively and perfectly. But at that stage, it can also be made to reflect anything. Instead of turning to the physical senses, it can turn equally to the divine consciousness. And the reflection he describes in the classic image as the sky in clear water, which is without ripple and unruffled by winds. And in this, the divine is reflected. And we have discussed in the classes earlier that the reflection, the analogy stops here. In the mind's reflection, it is not merely an image, it is the light of the divine which penetrates our mind, fills it, and lights up the mind itself. As a result, the working of the mind itself begins to change. The mind then grows in clarity, grows in its depth of reflection. It's not a superficial reflector anymore, it reflects far more deeply, far more completely, as the light from above fills it. And so this experience is extremely important and complements the earlier exercise of remaining immersed in the divine. And here one becomes very quiet, turning and opening ourselves. Where is the mind? Well, everywhere in your whole being. Your center of thought activity may be here, but the whole awareness is your mind. And so whole your awareness turns to the divine and opens itself. And if it can consciously give itself, inviting, invoking that, the more it becomes still, the more easily you feel. And what do you feel at first? It can take many forms, but immediately you feel a stillness, a silence. And if you let it deepen, it reveals itself as a deep, dense, profound silence. The silence of the self, revealing itself more and more to you. Or in that stillness, in that silence, you may reflect a presence that is conscious, the divine presence. If there is a personal turn in your consciousness to the divine as the divine mother, as the divine Lord, you may know the presence as being conscious. And then as this is felt, you give yourself more and more completely. The presence penetrates. The word reflection now becomes trivial. There is actually a penetration of the presence into your whole being. And Sri Aurobindo observes, the mind still does not entirely possess the divine or become divine, but is possessed by it or by a luminous reflection of it, so long as it remains in this pure passivity. And so this becomes the second complementing exercise, to remain in this poise and let that settle in us more and more. The limitation of this is that as soon as you move back in activity, things begin to fade. And so Sri Aurobindo says, to remain in this quiescent state and to receive only in the quiescent state is insufficient. But this is insufficient for the integral yoga. There must be a positive transformation and not merely a negative quiescence of the waking mentality. And so comes a very important discussion which we had last time. Is it even possible for the mind to be transformed in a way that it is not merely a reflector, but actually experiences these states, receives them, embodies them, and operates by their principles, which are, remember, opposite of the mind? Is it even possible? And Sri Aurobindo explains what it is, the key, the secret. He says, the transformation is possible because although the divine planes are above the mental consciousness, and to enter actually into them, we have ordinarily to lose the mental in samadhi. Yet, there are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper, although modified by the conditions dominant here of mentality. All that belongs to the experience of the divine plane can there be seized, but in a mental way and in a mental form. To these planes of divine mentality, it is possible for the developed human being to arise in the waking state, or it is possible for him to derive from them a stream of influences and experiences which shall eventually open to them and transform into their nature his whole waking existence. And so here we come to the key of the whole approach of the integral yoga and the whole concept of transformation, which is at the heart of the integral yoga. In all the traditional systems of yoga, philosophy, religion, the gap is never completely bridged. There may be an immersion in the divine, but the mind remains mind. At best, a little more lit up by the reflection. The heart may be purified, but it remains still separate. The body, in particular, remains at best a support, traditionally described as the wick for the flame. You see, the flame burns, the wick supports it, like the body supporting the divine presence. But the wick remains wick, the candle remains candle. The flame is another. And this, unfortunately, is the reality, and you will find this across all the traditions which survive. This is not so if you go back all the way to the Vedic tradition, where the concept of transformation does exist. The mind can be transformed, and that is the goal of the whole Vedic yoga. But the Vedic yoga stops short with the transformation of the mind and the emotions. The physical body consciousness does not yet participate in that transformation. The body remains, at best, as a support. And Sri Aurobindo, for the first time in the history of spirituality, asserts that the physical consciousness can equally be made a participant and can be divinized. For this purpose, he points out, when he began the work of transformation of the physical consciousness, he found that there was no imprint of earlier efforts in the universe. And that is an exceptional statement. It shows you how important this effort is, not only in the history of the earth, but in the history of the entire universe. If we step back and go beyond the limited knowledge that modern science offers to us, we will find life exists everywhere in the universe. And there are billions of planets with life, many of them with evolved mental life, with evolved spiritual life. But nowhere in the universe has the work of a physical transformation by the spirit, by the supramental consciousness, nowhere has it been done so far. There is no imprint of it, Sri Aurobindo points out. A mental transformation, yes, to make the body mentally conscious, yes, that has been done. To receive in the body the spiritual afflatus, yes, it has been done. The Vedic rishis were living in a supramental consciousness, and its reflection and action on the body would have been there as reflection. But to actually take up the physical consciousness and transform it in terms of the supramental has not been done. And we may say the only explanation for that is perhaps in the overall evolution of the cosmos, the time had not yet come. The Vedic experience itself stopped short, going close to the physical, but that was all that perhaps the cosmos was ready for in the larger evolutionary turn. And in that sense, when you look at this particular affirmation of Sri Aurobindo that the physical consciousness can and must be divinized, it is a new beginning for the whole universe, for which the focal point was here in Sri Aurobindo's physical consciousness and the mothers. The full scope of what they achieved in their consciousness is still not fully accessible to the human mind. But what we can understand, we must value in this sense. But the principle of transformation itself, he presents here in these 3 sentences. Although the reference is particularly to the mental consciousness, when we recognize the principle, it applies to our whole being. And we realize here, he says, the transformation is possible because although the divine planes are above the mental consciousness, and to enter them we must lose the mental in samadhi, yet there are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper. And this is a very important principle you will find described in the Veda, and of which the lines with today that we will be taking up go into in some depth. But the idea is this. The whole universe, remember, comes out from the oneness of the divine. As the oneness moves to form this multiplicity, it puts forward 7 principles. 7 principles which together make possible cosmos, an ordered creation instead of chaos. The key principle among the 7 is the principle which organizes everything and holds everything in perfect relation across the entirety of time and space. The tiniest detail, the tiniest subatomic particle, grain of sand, to the largest supergalaxies, all things are held in perfect relation in that consciousness. That power that holds and organizes all in perfect relation, that is the supramental. It is the power of knowledge, will of the divine by which the whole universe is formed and held as cosmos. This is the key, because it is this one power that at the same time holds the unity and the multiplicity. It knows both and links and harmonizes both. And so when we look at the whole universe and these 7 principles of which form everything, everything is in everything else. There is nothing which is fundamentally separate. You take any piece in the universe and you will find it is linked to the whole universe. In a way, the whole universe is represented within the grain of sand, within the flower, within each one of us. This, in fact, is one of the key foundational principles of the Vedic approach, that we are ourselves one with the whole universe and represent the whole universe and its totality and its potentiality. Our evolution, thus, is not only a representation of the universal evolution, but it is also a representation of the future possibilities of the cosmos. In other words, we hold within us the potential of that which created the universe. We are ourselves a universe. But this is true in principle of everything, because in everything the whole is held. And so when we look at it this way, within each principle of the 7 principles, everything else is represented, but underlying within the overall framework of that dominant principle. So in the material world, for example, all the gradations of consciousness of the cosmos are represented. At first, sleeping, hidden, potential, and then increasingly more and more revealed. And as the revealing movement continues, we have what we call evolution. But because they were involved, there could be an evolution. In the same way, in the life energies, in the world of life force, everything is represented, including the material principle, but subordinate to the life energy. And in the same way, in the mental consciousness, everything is represented, including the physical, but as a subordinate functioning. And so he says, in the mental being, there are divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper. That is, there's a reflection of the, no, reflection is the wrong word, there's the representation of the Satchidananda inside the mind. And the principles of Sat Chit and Ananda are actually represented operating under the conditions of, modified by the conditions of the mind. And so at that level, that grade, we can actually experience things of the Satchidananda while being in the waking mental consciousness. Except that these finer gradations of the mental being are superior to our normal mentality. But they are not inaccessible, and one does not require to enter into a loss of mind in a trance state. You can access them in the mental consciousness and therefore in waking state while fully engaged with the world, with life. But these are they're still superior to our normal mentality. In other words, we have to develop our capacity to become aware of these gradations, or rather, we have to evolve, because those things are already there, involved. We have to evolve those finer gradations of the mind, and this can be done by the mind as it is today. In fact, when we observe our mind's development as distinct from the rest of our being, we realize, in fact, in our normal mental working, these higher gradations are already present, but secretly. In other words, we are not conscious of them, but they are operative in us. For example, if I were to ask you just a casual question, do you remember which is your favorite memory of your parents or of grandparents or of a holiday, whatever it is, your favorite memory? Your mind turns and plop, something comes. Oh yes, that's my favorite. Did you turn inside you and sift through all the many decades of your life experience on earth to sift out and pick out which is my favorite, compare to, and no, this is more favorite, let's check with the next and compare with the next? That's what Google does. If you type on the Google search engine, fastest runner in the Olympics, longest river in the world, tallest mountain, what does it do? It needs to actually go into the full database of all the mountain heights, all the river lengths, and pick out by comparing. It's a long process. It may do that and store a temporary answer so that next time you ask, it doesn't need to do it again. So it's a little faster. But still, for the first time that it had to search, it had to go through that whole list to figure out which is the fastest, which is the tallest. Which is your favorite memory? Well, Google would have to actually go through all the memories in your mind to pick out. But what did you do? You didn't even struggle. You just turned with the intention to know, and something went plop and brought it out. Who did that? Who knew already? And that thing which knew did not need to search. It already held the full spectrum of all your memories like that in a single vision. It knew that you wanted an answer to this question. And the moment you turned to receive. That's the only difference. If the question was not asked or you had not turned, your mind is still turned outwards. Once in a while, something will pop out from there and you won't know from where. And you'll say, I just had a bright idea. But when the question is asked, you have turned with a specific intention, and in the act of turning, when the memory came out, you don't say, I just had an idea. You say, I remember. That's the only difference. I remember because I already sought to know, so I remember But who put it out? Who knew that you wanted this response? I don't know. It knows me. I don't know it. It has the power to know, or it has the knowledge of all my memories and can draw out what is my favorite, although I don't know it or its memories. It's not separate from you because it knows your favorite. It's not thinking, what is your favorite? It is the knowledge of your favorite. It is itself you, and yet you don't know it. And so you are aware, without much effort, that there are layers within you, or powers within you, faculties within you, levels of consciousness, perhaps, levels of being, levels of awareness, of which you are not conscious, but which are conscious of you. Are they developed? Well, they can already do all this. Go through all your life memories to pick out what is your favorite. Okay, favorite would be perhaps not the best example because you might have thought of which is your favorite memory. But if I ask you a question like, do you remember an incident in childhood when you got upset and regretted it? Poof, you will pull out not one but several. And perhaps this particular attempt to remember you have never done before. And so it has actually access right now instantly to everything. To these planes of divine mentality, it is possible for the developed human being to arise in the waking state. It is possible, but we need to do something for this, and we will shortly see what we have to do. Or it is possible for him to derive from them a stream of influences and experiences. And this is what we're doing. Each time we turn to remember something, each time we remember, each time we try to create something new. If I ask you to imagine an animal which you have never seen before and which no one has ever thought of before, well, your mind turns briefly and either something pops out or certain suggestions come, join and combine. But the very effort to draw something which has not been thought of before is an access to your creative power. And you are not at that point thinking out too much, though that would be a way of taking pieces which you construct. But where did the pieces come? From there, from some layer that you're not conscious of. If you are a skilled artist, if you are trained in creative activities, you will simply turn and pop, the whole image comes. In fact, you're taught to do that. And so he says, as you allow this influence and streaming of experiences to take place, he says, which shall eventually open to them, your mind shall eventually open to them and transform into their nature his whole waking existence. Eventually we can, by this streaming process, grow in closeness until the whole consciousness is now living in those states, in our waking existence. And then he says something which is where we paused last time. These higher mental states are the immediate sources, the large actual instruments, the inner stations of his perfection. 3 phrases he has used. First, he says, the immediate sources of our perfection. Every time you do something which is approaching perfection, the immediate source which makes possible this perfection is from these levels. Second, he says, the large actual instruments of his perfection. So actual instruments versus superficial or secondary instruments. When I write a beautiful poem, I think my mind has thought it out. But actually, there was something operating behind my mind's working which was pushing forward the suggestions. So the actual instruments of the perfection, especially if the poem is extremely beautiful, I'm aware that I could not have done it with my own capacity. It just kind of popped in, it came through. I was inspired. So the actual instruments of that inspiration, which makes something perfect, is from here. And third phrase he uses, the inner stations of his perfection. The station is the poise where the perfection is actually held, is a living state of being. Now you see in these three phrases, there are degrees of closeness. In the first, that is the immediate source. But you are here. The source is there, something comes in, and your whole focus is in the surface working. There's only a source from which things come. In the second degree, the actual instrument is there. You are much more aware that things are happening here. That's where the real stuff is. This is only the outermost expression on the surface. The real stuff and the instruments of my creativity and powers of perfection are there. In the third degree, I live in the poise of that consciousness which holds the perfection. And so the inner stations of his perfection. Now this paragraph describes the higher mental states and in their relation to our current mentality. And now we look at how exactly are these being bridged. How are we developing the link between them, or how are these powers or faculties in us beginning to awaken? So he says, to these planes of divine mentality, it is possible for the developed human being to arise in the waking state. That is one movement. And the second, or it's possible for him to derive from them a stream of influences and experiences. So two things happen. Your consciousness can rise up, and things from there can descend. And as before we have discussed, they are complementary movements. We are not aiming straight at the divine to arise in a state of trance when the mind becomes silent or is dismissed or is non-existent as you merge. We are only focusing on the representative gradations of the divine powers in the mind and making this bridge here. And through these representative gradations, the divine can be known in the way the mind can know the divine. And so the same effort which we did earlier is done on these gradations first, before going directly to the divine which is beyond the mind. So the mind turns in a kind of a quiet aspiration, becoming very quiet, becoming very still, to feel, to know, to dwell upon the divine. And in the first case, there's a sense of a rising into a higher, silent level of awareness. In the second case, there is something felt above, a presence, a knowledge, an inspiration, and we open like a flower to receive, and the thing flows into us. When these two movements alternate, increasingly a kind of an interpenetration takes place. That descending into the lower fills up your mind with a silence, with a sense of a light, an illumination, a kind of a power, a kind of an intensity. And all the faculties of your rational mind and rationality are suddenly intensified. Again, we have these occasionally spontaneously. We don't know why or how. One day you wake up and your mind is so clear, so fresh. Anything you take up is so easy and spontaneous. And there are other days when you struggle and everything is sluggish, difficult. You have to as if fight over the inertia of the mind's working. You don't feel anything. No light, no sense of fluidity, freshness, flowing, translucency. None of that is there. There's only this dullness, heaviness, even a kind of a clouding. You don't see, you don't understand clearly. And so we have these experiences. It's just that we do not know what it is that makes for this day or the other. We do notice that if you go to sleep after having read something which is uplifting, you wake up perhaps with a greater freshness. If you go to sleep having read something dull or disturbing, you do wake up more disturbed. That is one connection we see. But other than that, we're not conscious mostly. But as we take to the practice of the yoga, we can consciously turn to an awareness of something above. And it can start with a very simple effort. Sri Aurobindo presents this as a basic practice for meditation. He says, you turn your center of awareness above the head and simply become aware of the presence above. And when you remain like this for a while, a kind of a stillness is felt, or a peace, or a presence, all the things which we have discussed before. And then you invoke it. Let the peace settle in your mind. Let it settle in your brain. And eventually let it settle in your whole being. And with that peace, a light, a sense of a power, or even sense of a revealing knowledge, or a quiet joy, delight, even Ananda. These are all things he describes as descending from above. And the process is as simple as that, simply becoming quiet and turning in a quiet aspiration, invoking or becoming aware simply above. And if you make that first step, what descends then builds on what you have done. The condition of receptivity created is now intensified, it is purified, it creates a greater stillness, purifies and stills the mirror. Even filling your mind with light transmutes the very substance of your mental being. And if you are able to extend it into your whole being, all the way down, then after a while you realize your entire awareness is much more rarefied, more sensitive, more clear, more plastic, more awake, more aware. And before you know it, you notice that your earlier way of thinking has changed. Now, this is something which people who have read Sri Aurobindo have already experienced, but it is not so common normally in humanity. You see, when you read a book which is interesting, informative, even educative, you read it once, you've absorbed the content of it. Broadly, you don't need to reread. At best, to refresh certain facts, you may want to reread. But when you read Sri Aurobindo, after reading it, you realize he has so changed your worldview, your entire perspective, the way you looked at things, the scope of what you looked at, and the way you looked at it is so transformed that now when you review the same text, you see it differently. You understand it more deeply. You appreciate it, the whole completeness of it, much more. And having passed through it a second time, you find now your perspective has become even more deep, rich, and complete. And you go back and you realize the same text reveals so much more. The difference is Sri Aurobindo changes the mold of your mind. Your mental consciousness itself is recast. And the result is now you can reread a text written from a poise which is much more complete. You can reread it and understand it differently. Your thinking changes, your worldview changes. And this happens as this higher substance, higher grade of a spiritual consciousness begins to fill your mind, it reshapes it. In fact, that's what Sri Aurobindo does when you read. As an aside, Mother had originally instructed that when books were published in the ashram press, the entire set of books was to be brought to her room so that she would concentrate on them to invoke the spiritual force, and then they would be sent for the sales and distribution. In the later years, she complained to one of the persons from the ashram press. She said, they don't understand why I asked them to do this. and they're satisfied in sending me just one book. You see, for the people who did not know the value of this, they said, well, what's the point of taking all the books? It's enough if she sees one book. Well, she did what she had to do to compensate for it. But the result is, when the book is infused with that consciousness and you read it, as you dwell upon it, that power which is infused in the book is actually settling into you as you dwell on the words and the sense. Even if it was not done explicitly, the very fact that you're dwelling on Sri Aurobindo's consciousness and his words opens you in this way to his consciousness, which fills you and molds you from within. But this principle is operating in us as we remain thus. And very quickly, you will notice your way of thinking has changed. And one of the first changes you would notice is you don't have to struggle so hard. You turn to understand something and it's spontaneous. You don't need to think it out too much. Just a little effort and the thing becomes clear. And so there's a transition. Less struggle of thought, less labor of machinery of mind, more seeing. But also at the same time, you notice the scope of what you see is larger, much more multifaceted, multidimensional, multi-layered. You no more see things in flat black and whites. You no more see things as just a few pieces. You see continuities. Every situation is a continuum. And there are facets, there are aspects, there are viewpoints which cut up the continuum, but you begin to see more and more of the continuum. So every time somebody places a contrary viewpoint, you see, this joins with that, and you see the continuity. And then the things which seemed opposite now appear complementary. And it's because your mind has changed. Because these higher gradations are now more operative inside your mind's working. And as this becomes more and more settled, there is a shift in the very thinking of your mind. It sees in large chunks, it sees in wholes. It is still thinking out, perhaps, but in a broad, big picture. You have a little problem here, 10 people have tried to solve it in this way or that, but when you look at it, you see the big picture, things which others didn't see. And because it's a larger scope, you shift something around and the whole problem is solved, just like that. And this is when the mind is operating on this higher grade, which Sri Aurobindo has named higher mind. And this happens simply reading Sri Aurobindo. If you have trained your mind not to be just thinking out the words and summarizing the ideas, then you would have remained merely as a philosopher or an academic. But if you've trained your mind to become quiet and to receive the impact of what he says, to understand more deeply the way he forms it, then your mind is being reshaped and the higher power of the mind's thinking develops. You grow into higher mind. And then from there, less and less of the thought, more and more of the seeing grows into what he describes as the illumined mind. And then the seeing itself takes on multifaceted, more and more complete views until you see from all sides, including from inside out, so deeply, so intimately, that you become as if one with what you see. And very smoothly, there's a transition into what he calls the intuitive mind. But through all this, you can see a continuum. There is no jump. There is no sudden loss. There is no loss in trance. There is no breaking out. There is no chasm, no gap. A continuum, and your whole mind is being filled more and more with light and substance of these higher gradations. And the whole thinking power, cognitive power, changes. And with the intuitive mind, you know things because you experience an identification in some part of your mind. And in the identification, you know where you are identified and where you're not. You know what you know and what you don't, and so on. And so from there, for the first time, you have the power of true knowledge, which is not corrupted. however partially. But in what it knows, it is true, uncorrupted, error-free. It knows its own limitations. It knows that beyond this, it does not know. And then, of course, if you make the error of mixing your old habitual mind thought, jump in the confidence that the intuition gives you, you have the mixed intuition and you have errors. And when the error is corrected for you, you realize immediately, oh yes, I sensed that here it was not clear. I jumped. And bit by bit, you learn to sift the movement, the mixture from the true intuition. And all of this, in a way, is already happening to us as we are. Except it is a very slow process across years. Over the years, I say, I have learned to trust this particular vibration that I feel inside me. And I found whenever I distrust it or I follow my rational or my desire impulse, I regret. So over the years, gradually, I've learned to distinguish this very fine, subtle feel. That's a long time. That's a slow way. But the process he has described here of turning in quiet, in silence, and receiving and allowing this immersion, infusion of these higher gradations into us, into the mind's awareness, can enormously speed up this process, 100-fold, even 1,000-fold. And the result is, within a year or two, you're completely different in the way you think, in the way you are, in the way you experience the world. Everything is different. To these planes of the divine mentality, it is possible for the developed human being to arise in the waking state. And all this is happening in your normal waking life. You may still take a little time to concentrate, to enter in deep concentration, either on these states or simply on the immersion in the divine consciousness, and allow the divine force, the divine Shakti, the mother's force to work in you, to form, to mold, to fill yourself, to fill your mind, your body, your energies with her light and force, recast, reshaping. For that, you may still be in a state of deep immersion and concentration, or then extending that into your daily life. All of these will assist in the process because you turn to consciously engage. Mother Sri Aurobindo explains in his commentary on the Vedas, in a very interesting article, he lists out the key principles of the Vedic yoga. And there he explains that the gods, as divine powers, they operate normally in their domain, which is in the divine level of consciousness. But from there, because they are cosmic beings, they work on all planes, including our mentality, vitality, and physical body. On all planes they operate. But they are freely operating in their own plane. In these planes, they are subject to the limitations of these planes. When they operate in our mind, they are subject to the limitation of our mind because it's our mind. So they need, in a sense, our permission to be able to work freely. That's where it becomes important for the sadhaka to consciously invoke, to consciously give himself. Now he's explaining this in the context of the Vedic yoga, but you see how it applies when you turn to the divine and to the Divine Mother. Yes, she works even in spite of your refusal. Sri Aurobindo writes, I think to Nirod Baran, he says, because you have come to me, even if you don't make the effort, I have to catch you by the scruff of the neck and make sure that you progress. But that's a slow process. If we consciously open ourselves and consciously call, invoking, and consciously give, allowing her action to work in us, then that process is enormously speeded up because there is no more the resistance and opposition of the unconscious I, or even the resistant and rebellious nature. The conscious self-giving allows her action to speed up enormously. And this is where all this, the practice, becomes so important. The result is, there is this double movement that our consciousness begins to rise into these higher gradations, and meanwhile, a stream of influences and experiences flows through. And now these three phrases is what I wanted to dwell on. These higher mental states are the immediate sources, the large actual instruments, the inner stations of his perfection. And so we look at these three particularly in the context of our activities in life. The immediate source of all our perfection is coming from here. And that means we can consciously make an effort to turn to the source. Now this can take several forms. For example, let's say you're going to start a work. Suppose, let's take a few examples where it is more obvious, and then we'll see how we apply it to the less obvious ones. Suppose you have to write an article, or you have to play a piece of music, or sing. If you start doing, who's going to do? You. But remember, the source, immediate source of your perfection is here. Just behind, just above. Now you can take two poises. One is to say it's a poise of consciousness within you, and you open to it. Or you can say it is her force, her consciousness, her power, and you open to the mother. That depends on your nature. For some people, this opening to your own consciousness is easier. For some people, opening to the mother is easier. For some people, opening to the mother is a little difficult because she and I are different. I have to give myself. That's not so comfortable. I feel more comfortable doing myself. Giving myself is a weird feeling. So for them, you think of it as your own higher states, your own deeper powers. For others, especially where the heart and the bhakti is more open, to give yourself is the easier way. Then you invoke her and you say, Mother, help me. But then the condition, remember, your receptivity, all that has been discussed earlier, you become very quiet. You make yourself as still as you can, mirror-like, and turn exclusively in concentration to that poise, that inner state, to her, her consciousness, her force. Mother, in fact, said it in so many words to the children in the ashram school when they were going to do their physical exercises, gymnastics, athletics. She said, call me, ask for my help, and I will help you to do what you're doing better than you can. Now people read that, they hear that, and they say, it's a nice message. Yes, mother says she's there. Yeah, she's there, some invisible influence. But finally, I'm doing. And this poise is very important. You actually let go of yourself and say, Mother, you feel, you work, you act. Now, again, initially, you may do this for a few seconds, and then finally, you have to get back to doing it. And you may still feel like more of you, less of her, but you're doing. But after a while, that balance shifts. You will feel more of her and less of you doing. So you start with I'm doing, but having made that concentration, that prayer, that call, that opening, and you feel something fills, works through you. So you do this, writing, some creative activity, and you feel the difference when that thing flows. It's a matter of experience, and a vivid experience. Now the same thing you could extend to anything else, any other activity. You have to wash vessels, pause, concentrate, invoke, and let this action be also done in consecration to her and inspired by her force. You have to sweep the floor. It could be as simple as this. You walk the steps to climb up or down. You can do it in the same way. Any activity in principle. The only limitation is your ability to remember and to consciously open or give yourself to whatever partial degree. But in principle, one could do it everywhere. Of course, one starts with the more important ones where you feel the need for that, but later you want to extend it. So, this is the first effort that you will make. The second thing which will happen is, as you dwell in this experience, you have a clear sense of familiarity with a state which is as if lifted up. You feel as if yourself lifted, brighter, clearer, higher, wider, even vaster. You make yourself familiar with this. Teach yourself to be more often in that state, longer in that state. So when you first do this in a concentrated way, a simple activity, and you have this uplift, you consciously try to extend it a little more and a little more. You consciously try to remain in your awareness in this widened and freer state. Less active, quieter, seeing mind, and you let it grow familiar. You choose to slant your preference more to these than to the old way. And that speeds up the whole shift. And so very quickly, there is a transition. First, by turning to the immediate source, just that action of turning and then holding and building on this layer. The second phrase he has used is the large actual instruments. And now this takes the effort on a new level. Remember, the first level was turning to the source, and then you are still doing. In the second level, you realize the actual instrument doing it is there. Remember the question when I asked, what was your favorite memory? The instrument which held in largeness the full memory of your life experience has to be a consciousness which is wide enough to hold it all, isn't it? And those instruments are all wide, large, vast. They embrace knowledge. They don't travel like a worm picking up little pieces. They go around and just grasp the whole in a single sweep. Those are your real instruments. When your mind goes through a logical process, if you say A leads to B and B leads to C, therefore A leads to C. It's obvious. Why should it be so? You could ask. But there's a part of you seeing which says, oh yeah, it's obvious. That part does not need to think out. The surface mind is going through this mechanical process. A layer behind is seeing the truth of the logic. And if there's a flaw in the logic, something says, something is not okay in what you just said. That part is watching, but it's not you, it's not the active you, it's behind you. And its influence pops into you when something goes wrong here. You become aware that there is this. And this is where the real seeing, the real thinking is happening. And these are the large actual instruments. And something very interesting happens gradually. You are doing this thinking process, and then a part of you remains as if here, watching, very quiet. And as this activity is going on, it shows, it leads the way, and it points to this. So you're trying to solve a problem, you've been chasing it in this way, in this particular direction, but when you shift there, it sees the big picture. And it points there, and your whole attention on the lower layers turns, and you get the solution. In fact, this is what is already happening when, having tried long enough and failed in your problem, you say, I give up for today, I need to rest. I will come back with a fresh mind. What does that mean? And you come back with a fresh mind, you're no more obsessed with this. Your active parts have become quiet, and the large actual instruments behind have pushed forward their suggestion, their seeing. And you come back to face the same problem, suddenly your attention shifts to this other area, which you did not even think about. And you see it differently. The seeing was imprinted from there into your surface active parts. And you become conscious of this. The part which saw, that's the real instrument. That's the larger actual instrument. And so bit by bit, a kind of a familiarity grows of this layer, which is otherwise very quiet. You may actually use an exercise to develop this power of awareness, which Sri Aurobindo recommends here. And for this, he says, train yourself to shift the center of thinking above the head. Now, it may sound very simple, but he explains, because the center of your intuitive consciousness is above the head, about 2 centimeters above, and the center of the thinking mind is here inside, center of the brain somewhere behind the forehead. By shifting your center of awareness and thought to above head, you come closer to the actual center of the intuition. And so its influence in your thinking is stronger. Now, it's a very simple exercise. It may take an effort of a few days to familiarize yourself to be able to be centered above head while doing certain activities, while reading, while interacting, conversing, or just doing some mechanical work. And once that becomes habitual, it extends into your thought powers. And the result is, rather than feeling this part, these large actual instruments, as behind supporting your frontal thinking mind, you will feel yourself closer in these parts. And the thinking parts of the mind becoming almost superfluous, necessary only in articulating, but even that they move smoothly in the influence of this part, which is very still and quiet. So before you can shift up, he recommends training your mind to become silent. That's the foundation. And then shift the center up. And then the third thing here, which he recommends, is wait. Wait for the inspiration to initiate. Remember, we rush forward. Instead of rushing forward as the doer, you hold the intention, tune yourself, center yourself in this inner or higher poise, opening to the source, to the mother, to her force, if possible, shifting yourself in these quieter, deeper, or higher parts, and wait. Wait for the action itself to be initiated from there. So far we were dwelling more on the knowledge. Now comes the aspect of the will, the force of the action. And something comes, it leads, it inspires, it carries, and it can go down to the physical action, including where even your hands, if you're writing, you're playing an instrument, even your hands move, led by that. Mother describes when Sri Aurobindo wrote the Arya. She said the inspiration poured down from above, his mind was completely silent, and the inspiration flowed directly into the fingers. Now, that does not mean his mind was not aware. It was not automatic writing. His mind was very much aware. It was seeing in the silence. And the knowledge was formulating itself through his consciousness, but the force of expression was going straight into the fingers. Everything else is streaming transparent, and the fingers move. The same thing would happen if you were to sing. Then it would act through the throat and the vocal cords and your whole body, perhaps. Or any other activity, if you're dancing, if you're drawing, if you're walking, if you're jogging, doing exercises, if you're doing asanas, whatever form it may be, it can go all the way down to the physical impulse in the body. And in this way, that higher consciousness is not only infusing to transform your mind and the mental consciousness, but into the life force and its dynamism, and into the physical body and substance, and even its tissue. And the whole of your being is then aligned in this way. So, the first degree was turning to the immediate source consciously to invoke. The second degree is becoming conscious of this higher grade as the actual instruments, and they become the doer more and more from here, from these levels, from these states, from the source, in the mother's consciousness, her inspiration, her light, her force. That is the actual instrument. And then comes a third degree, which you can see how it would become naturally the poise, you live in that. And so these are the inner stations of the perfection. You live there, that's the station of your consciousness. And when that happens, the poise is established. The diviner gradation of consciousness which has so far been developed, whichever of the gradations it is now a constant state, effortlessly, spontaneously. In some of the greatest musicians, artists, composers, singers, in the greatest ones, they are great precisely because they draw on this intuition, even if unconsciously. The whole training was only a means to somehow become aware of this and to be able to enter consciously in this poise and to let it flow. To the extent that that is there, they have become great and masters in their field. To the extent that this is unstable, we see the potential of mastery, but not yet the mastery. So, a spiritual approach to any of these systems would develop consciously these higher levels of awareness and their integration with the rest of our being. And this was broadly the framework of training in the Indian system of all the arts, in particular music, instrumental, vocal, and art and painting. But you will see in the training for the musician, the first part would be as a child, as a student, you serve the master. You do his dishes, you sweep his floor, you look after all his needs. And you say, what's all this to do with your capacity to sing or play an instrument? It has everything to do with it if you look at it from the consciousness viewpoint. When the person becomes a perfect servant to his master, he actually begins to feel, he is thirsty, anticipates, senses the thirst, and places the glass of water without a word being said. This happens because his consciousness has already attuned itself with his teacher. And the attuning now done in this way, the whole consciousness of the teacher and his ability to experience this state or to draw down this inspiration can be directly imprinted into the student. And that person becomes the best student. He becomes the next teacher, the great master, because he has developed in himself that complete poise of being able to be transparent, reflecting, and in a state of surrender to the teacher, to his greatness, not so much his crude physical habits, but his greatness which he embodies, for which you've come as a student. But you can see the principle. It would mean developing in you the humility, the poise of stillness, the receptivity, the turning of consciousness to the higher things, and so on. Similar things you will find in certain old ways of teaching the martial arts and so on. But we get the idea. We don't need to follow those methods, but once you catch the principle, you can apply it in your own way. But this third degree is when the consciousness is poised there, the inner station of his perfection. At this point, Sri Aurobindo puts a footnote. And the footnote is very important. Called in the Veda, the word inner stations, he writes, called in the Veda variously, seats, houses, placings or statuses, footings, earths, dwelling places. Now 6 phrases, and in Sanskrit, sadas, griha or kshaya, dhamma, padam, bhumi, kshiti. That Sri Aurobindo bothers to put a footnote there and list all these is an indication. He's connecting this to the whole wealth of knowledge implied by each of these words. And we need to dwell upon each of them briefly, just to understand the nuance, the phrasing, the keyword used, the nuance, because all of them come under one term, the inner stations. So you could just go with that. It includes all these things. You don't bother with the detail. But if you get into the detail, you'll find some extraordinary insights and knowledge and the whole philosophy and even aspects of the practice. So I'll not go too much into it, but just enough that we can appreciate why he puts the footnote. You'll see the list of names: seats, houses, placings or statuses, footings, earths, dwelling places. There's a sequence. Starting from something which is less temporary to something which is more permanent. What is a seat? Somewhere you sit and you leave. It's a temporary seat. House, you dwell, you go in, out. Actually, the word, we have to see the Sanskrit word to understand the full sense of it. Placings or statuses, you have reached a certain status in a hierarchy. You've placed yourself in a poise, and you can see it has a more stable position. Footing, the placement of your feet fixed, on which now everything else is supported, which supports the rest of the edifice. And then earths. We'll look at the Sanskrit terms and you will see the full sense of it. Many earths, each of these are as if states of being, and then dwelling places where you live in permanence. So we'll look at the Sanskrit words and look at the deeper sense of each. The first is seat, and the Sanskrit term is sadas. And it is one of those root sounds, root words, which you will find actually spanning many different languages of the world. In Latin, you will find it is the same word sedere, which means to sit, to remain, to be fixed, to be settled. And it's the same sense in Sanskrit, sadas. But the idea is you come to something and are fixed in it and settled in it. You come, sit, and go into a state of relaxation there. You remain. But there's still the sense that it does not belong to you. It is not your home. It is a small seat. It is not the whole dwelling place. There's a sense of the smallness, temporariness, and a movement to it and eventually away from it. So this is inner station of his perfection, the first degree of the inner station, where you are there, temporarily seated, and you have this beautiful musical performance, and then you come back from the seat and go back to your normal activity, your normal consciousness. I've actually seen this in many great musicians. They have a formal performance in the evening. One of my aunts is one of the famous musicians in Maharashtra of a national stature, and she is often invited to initiate the first program in the music festivals. And I've seen her when she did a performance in the ashram. So here she was very ordinary in her chatting, normal interactions, and that day was a program. When she came from the guest house, you could already see a shift in her consciousness. And then she waited, she concentrated, she took whatever rituals, drinking warm water and preparing your throat and all that. Details don't matter, they are her rituals. And then concentrating, praying, and then she bowed down before each person in the family to take your blessings. It's no more she. It is the blessings which make the performance divine. So you have to take blessings from who? All the elders, from all the deities, from whatever for you represents higher consciousness or opening to divine inspiration. Then after that, going there, the whole person was different. It was not the same person. There was a poise of great inner strength, deep confidence. You don't recognize the person anymore. None of the casual chit-chat, none of the wandering of the mind, none of the disturbance of emotions, but still center like a core pillar which is solid, fixed. And then she sits down and the first movement starts. And the moment the first chant begins, the pitch is picked And you can feel in the pitch a great depth, a great movement, a force which fills. And the person is already in a state of semi-trance, totally concentrated in the poise of whatever it is that she is drawing in her inspiration. And then building through that until finally the whole thing is over. There's a applause at the end of the program. The person is still glowing, and then you can see quickly the consciousness dropping. And then they come now gradually, the activity, the frittering, disturbance, all that begins to flow out. Within an hour or two, you're pretty much back to your normal, agitated, surface personality. But this was the seat. Literally, physically, you go and sit on the seat of authority, on the seat of the performance. But in consciousness, you're shifting to the seat of the inspiration, of the perfection. And then you get down from the seat. In Hindi, they use the word gaddi, meaning the seat of authority. So the seat of the teacher, the guru, the master of the lineage is there. And only that person is authorized to sit. And they actually use this phrase, who holds the gaddi? Who holds the seat? Who is the head of the lineage? In other words, who holds that poise of consciousness which holds the whole lineage and whatever teaching is there. Being on the seat, in consciousness, you get into the seat. That's the sense of this. That's why the word seat or sadas. But it's a poise, temporary, where you're still founded but off. And it's narrow poise. The next degree of this inner station is the word houses. House or griha or kshaya in Sanskrit. Two words he has used. Now griha is the root sense is the holding, grasping. In Sanskrit, for taking something, you would use the word griha. It's house. It's also the same term you will find used in Sanskrit for planets. In astrology, graha. And Sri Aurobindo explains the term. He says the word planet in English is the wrong term. In the Sanskrit astrology, they say graha because these are the bodies which have a hold on us. That's the relationship. That's why the moon is not a planet, right? Sun is not a planet. So the planet word does not apply. They are grahas. They are objects which have a hold on circumstances, an influence which grasps. So this is the term here, a holding, but also a sense of limiting. When you hold, you limit yourself to what you hold. And that's the sense of the house. You limit yourself to something which you embody, which you hold, which you contain, which is grasped or which grasps. And that's the poise taken. Not seat, but more than seat, there is a grasping and a holding in this, but necessarily a sense of limiting in relation to something greater. So the sense of something greater is there. And these are terms used in the Veda to catch these fine nuances. The third degree of this inner station is the placings or statuses. And the word used is Dhamma. You may have heard this term used to often describe names of places, sacred spots. You go to such and such a Dhamma, which is a sacred place for pilgrimage, for example. And this Dhamma is also associated with the root. See, the associated word in Sanskrit is Svedame, in their own station, in their own poise, status. And the Dame is common to the word in the Latin or European languages with dominion, domus, Dei, house of God. You have heard these terms. And it is also the original root for the word dame or damsel. Dame is the lady of the house, the lady who owns the house. So the sense of the ownership of a position, a status in the house. And so here the idea is a status of consciousness, but it is not yet large. It is not yet foundation for other things. but it is now an established poise. The next degree, the translation is footing. In Sanskrit, padam. And here, in the Vedic language, this has a great import. I will describe it in two ways. First, Sri Aurobindo refers to I think it is in one of his earlier writings, Vishnu's 3 steps in evolution. 1 foot, 2nd foot, 3rd foot, and the evolution is complete. So the first footing, Vishnu places his feet on the earth, the physical life. 2nd foot, he places in the mind, swara, the mental world, the mental life. And the 3rd foot, he places in the home, in the spiritual world. And that is our next step in evolution. So we have a physical life, we have a mental life, and we have a spiritual life. And they're the 3 steps of Vishnu in the evolution. Now, when you go from one step to the next, you're not obliterating the previous step. In the journey, yes, he has taken 3 steps, but in the realization, all 3 are there. So in the Veda, there is another phrase which goes, Padbhyam Prithivi. Earth is his footing. Now, it does not mean he places his feet and moves on. This is the foundation on which he places his feet and supports his whole being. So there's another idea, Chatushpada Brahmana, 4-footed Brahman. Meaning the Brahman, when he manifests, bases himself on 4 foundations, 4 feet are his support. So the whole idea of footing here is of a foundation on which the divine rests in the manifestation. So the 3 steps of Vishnu, the divine manifests in matter, in the mental life, in the spiritual life, and then the manifestation is complete. But they're the 3 bases, the 3 poises, the 3 feet of the full creature being that is the divine. So footing, you can see, has a much wider connotation. Here, you are established as if, and it's a foundation for something now flowing, manifesting, expressing. And then 2 more steps remaining. The next one is earths or bhumi, Sanskrit. Bhumi comes from the root bhu, to be. States of being, literally. Okay, so you are now poised in this state of being. So you can see it's a step up from the feet placed. This is your being. This is you. This is your poise of being. And it has the sense of being a psychological state of consciousness now developed. And there's one last step remaining, which is dwelling place. And the word in Sanskrit is kshiti. And this, when you look at the dictionary, very interestingly, the sense of kshiti is the sense of possession, of power, of mastery. So from this poise, which is your home, dwelling place, you have the sense of dwelling and mastering the whole domain. And it is at this poise that we can say the inner station is in a state of complete development in evolution, mastery of that level. So inner station of his perfection. So Sri Aurobindo has described 3 degrees. These higher mental states are the immediate sources, the large actual instruments, the inner stations of his perfection. And the inner stations themselves, we have seen 6 finer gradations of their development and the link to the Veda. And when the Veda uses this vocabulary precisely to catch nuances of the experience, he makes this quick link. And so here we are, where Sri Aurobindo has given us a means, and around that, an actual practice that by which the mind can be taught to open to its own higher diviner possibilities. And for those diviner possibilities to be infused into the mind and transform the mind in their image, in their terms. And this is captured in the description here. As a result of this, the mind now can enter in waking consciousness in relation to the divine. But there's still one more problem. In fact, there will be two more. But the next problem is, but in arriving to these planes or deriving from them, the limitations of our mentality pursue us. And then he explains how mind divides the experience of the divine, catching this aspect or that, and what happens when it does that. And then the second limitation of the mind will be in attempting to harmonize all these different facets of the experience. But for this we will discuss next time. What is important here is what is given so far is enough for our mind as it is to be able to grow into in relationship with the divine, experience more and more of the divine's infusion in it, and begin a process of transformation which makes all the rest possible. So I think we pause here in our study for today, and we can take up any questions, any comments. I've done a quick summary of what we had studied earlier in this chapter. So those of you who are interested in going more in detail can look at the previous recordings of the classes online. But in this, you can see how he opens a possibility for humanity, which promises the certainty and makes certain the divine life on earth in the waking and physical consciousness.
In the first half of this discussion, if I remember correctly, it was said that there are life forms in different parts of the universe. Mm-hmm. And could you give some kind of example? Because okay. Scientists are looking for this and sending spacecrafts all around.
Yes. Yes, the question is about life forms everywhere in the universe. You know, if you look at the logic of evolution, as Sri Aurobindo presents it, that life force is involved in all matter. Matter could not exist if there was not embedded within it life energy, which itself presupposes the involvement of the mind which guides the life energy. Matter could not have the perfect form of the crystalline or atomic structure if there was not the life force and the mind, and behind it the supermind. So anywhere that there is matter in the universe, eventually life force has to leak out and begin to express itself more and more directly. And mind has to emerge out of that, and supermind has to emerge out of that. Everywhere in the universe, without exception. The difference is only of degrees of speed and the particular variations of forms of life. So there may be life forms which for us are currently unimaginable. We are carbon-based. There could be other bases. But that life will emerge and mind will emerge out of life, and the spiritual will emerge out of mind, is inevitable everywhere. So any planet where life has begun the process, it's only a question of how long. There is, of course, the danger of life destroying itself when the mind emerges sufficiently and is going through the same passage of transition that humanity is going through today, where the mind is still largely ruled by the ego and desire, and has not yet consciously turned to the deeper truth of the spirit. But it has the power to. And at that point, it feels itself Lord and King, takes the ego, exaggerates itself to play the role of the divine, and considers itself the creator. And that's when we get into these either extreme forms of war, of exaggerated egos, or the power given to create includes the power to destroy. And we are starting to mess around with the very foundations of life, and we could perhaps break it down even. So we are on that brink. We could choose to go up or collapse. And this has not happened once, it's happening everywhere in the universe, everywhere that evolution reaches this point. So the question is really whether all these life forms around, how frequent they are. According to the most conservative estimates of modern science, where they say just by chance, if life had to emerge, it'll be something like out of all the planets, a certain percentage, 1% would have the necessary temperature and water. Out of that, 1% of 1% would have the necessary carbon base. Out of that, 1% of 1% would have necessary whatever. And you have a whole formula. The result of that formula, given the number of galaxies and stars, with all being conservative estimates, the result of that formula would be at least a few billions of planets with a developed, evolved mental life exist in the universe. The question only is whether they can communicate among themselves. And we would like to believe, and it would be foolish not to believe, that some have crossed enough to be able to travel great distances and might even be visiting the earth and maybe helping, because they're worried that we might not make this passage. If we accept that the earth itself is a special focal point in the evolution, and we discussed that earlier about the supramental transformation of the body, if earth is such an important place for the divine, then obviously not only beings from other planets would be interested, but beings from the higher planes of existence would be also watching over and intervening to protect human beings from their own stupidity. And on all levels, this kind of intervention is happening even now, both to help and to destroy on both sides. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, in that sense, Earth is the most significant center. Mother's comment on this is also relevant. She says, Earth is the one planet in the whole universe where the psychic principle has been developed fully. Other places it may be present, but it's not the primary focus of the development.
Yeah. I was touched by what you said, and I know it, that reading and studying Sri Aurobindo, how always the consciousness is opening up again in new ways. And since longer time than more than a year, I experienced how as a small child, I had this, what you spoke here, of the waking consciousness, that was my normal way. And for me, it is also more that we are more, how you say, know this more and more carefully with children, but also with adults, when this, how to give this time to step back or to go in this poise, and it was also in All India. It's in the recent one. I saw the quotation from Sri Aurobindo: "This agitation and quick things stop." He really wrote big STOP, so that we go more in this awareness, this calmness, and be conscious of it and support it in our daily life. I think that is very, very much needed for the process. True. But I think also that in this waking consciousness, this trance or this connection, many children are in it. And this to be aware of, that is not so new. And so that was the other thing. And then I would like to know also about, and it becomes more and more aware that I lived since long in the subliminal, and what you can tell about this compared to maybe next time or another time or so.
So just as an observation in the line of what you've said, I would say all of us here have had some spiritual experience in childhood, and perhaps even lived in certain states which were abnormal compared to others at that age, or have had some experiences frequently enough that the stamp of the spiritual inner development remained for the rest of our life. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. I have known equally of many children in whom the spiritual development was so much in front in their childhood, but in some part because of the environment of parents or society or the educational system in particular, it was beaten down so much that they have as if lost it in their adult life. They become hardened, closed, covered up. The potential is still there inside, but in their surface personality, you can see a complete seal and block. If the inner being is sufficiently awake, it may gradually penetrate through this and send out reflections, or even at some point suddenly break, but that is always a difficult passage. Break to come forward. But normally it will be a more gradual process, but it means they lose so much time in their life. Unfortunately, in the modern education, particularly the last 30 years, the system of education beats and suppresses the inner much more, compelling you to be more and more exteriorized in your senses, to neglect and ignore the deeper and higher lights, reflections, or inspirations, and dulling it to such a point that you dismiss those automatically by habit as imaginations or unreal or untrue. And so there's a lot of unlearning to be done once you cross into adulthood to recover what you already had in your childhood. And so much of life is wasted in that recovery and the unlearning. If only we could assist that process from the beginning, we would save so much trouble. The other side is the comment you made about the subliminal and deeper layers. Again, as children, we would have access to them often in our daydreams. And that's why I took that example, because it is so common to us. There's one incident I'm reminded of in the ashram school in the 60s. There was one child in the class, he would always fall asleep. And the teachers were fed up, and finally they reported to the mother. And they said, we want to remove this child because try as we might, he refuses to stay awake, he falls asleep. And the mother sent back a message saying, you know what? Every time that he's sleeping and you're complaining that he's sleeping, his inner being comes to me. Okay, so let the children be. If only we had the inner sight, we would see what was really happening, or at least sense that what was there was healthy and there was nothing to worry about. As long as they're children, we should not worry about it at all. But it means also for teachers to be able to now perceive more deeply in order to be able to assist that inner layers and give it the necessary nourishment and support. Yes, yes. 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 So there are inner layers which naturally open us to the wider reality. And as children, we sense, you see a dog who is suffering, you feel the pain of the dog in yourself. And that's so normal for a child. But if you've been taught to ignore and suppress that, then of course, very quickly, you're hardened. But if it's there and you find it difficult to manage, then you often go through a process of learning to barricade yourself enough to be able to function freely. But this is very common also with children. The key would be, as teachers or as parents, we assist them to recognize what it means and learn how to utilize that deeper connection with things. And it's easy at that age to tell children, look, all these creatures, including the plants, animals, even the earth and the substance of the earth, they are all conscious. And they are all equally your siblings, your friends, your brothers and sisters. And you relate to them as your own family. This is done in many of the indigenous traditions, as in the Native American and others, at least in the more developed of those cultures. but it is lost the moment we pass through the normal education, which defines reality by material terms only.
Can I? Yes. I'm reading the Adventures of the Consciousness, just a little deviation. I'm trying to know what the meaning of the word determinism. Determinism of a higher plane in the determinism of a lower plane, what it exactly means.
Okay.
Thank you.
Determinism is a term used to describe the sense we have that certain things seem to be already predetermined. You try as much as you can, you somehow seem unable to avoid certain things from happening. Sometimes in your own life, sometimes in external circumstances. It's as if some force, some kind of destiny, and these are all words we use to say we don't know what, something compels events beyond our capacity to prevent. If everything was purely material, then you would say there is a physical determinism. If you drop an object, it will fall at this particular speed with this particular force. That's a physical determinism. When you look at the psychological domain, you sense a psychological determinism. That in spite of your best efforts, although psychology is much more plastic, in spite of your best efforts, when this group comes together, this sort of thing happens, this kind of conflict happens, and we're not unable to prevent it. Okay? But there is something which is still higher, a kind of a spiritual determinism, where what the spirit sees, what the spirit chooses, works out through the psychological and physical processes in a way that nobody can ever prevent. That would be the sense of the spiritual determinism or fate. In the problem we have about fate and free will, we see the working of both. You have a free will practically, but there are things you cannot do with your free will. There is also kind of a fate compelling. The understanding from the highest position is there is the free will of the self, which is the only thing that exists. And it is utterly free. What the self chooses in its freedom to manifest becomes the determinism in the evolution, in the creation. You see, that is the spiritual determinism. And nothing can oppose it because everything is self. Even what opposes this will is the self. So it also is used and helps for the thing to happen. I'll give an example here. You look at the human being, and you can see in history thousands of attempts to suppress a human being or a group of human beings by enslaving them, by brainwashing them, by denying them, by all possible methods. Inevitably, there's a revolution and some breaking out. And that's a spiritual determinism because the human being is not just body and mind and emotions. It is spirit hidden inside, concealed behind all these. And spirit is free. And because it is free, nothing you do externally can ever suppress that freedom because you cannot bind the spirit. You can bind the body, you can bind the mind. With the spirit being free, you cannot bind it. Its freedom survives and eventually it overcomes because this freedom is a greater truth. So there will be a revolt, there will be a reaction, there will be an overthrow, etc., etc. That's one of the things which you can see as and claim even as a spiritual determinism. What form doesn't matter. Unless the spirit chooses, it will be in this form. Then you will have that form also. And everything you do to prevent it can at best delay, but actually serves to intensify the eventual result. The more you suppress, the stronger the revolt will be. You see? And if you assist the awakening, then of course it happens faster and smoother. Whatever you do, it will happen. And this is the truth of for all of us in our evolution. Because it is the choice of the soul, we will realize the divine. We will manifest the divine. And to the extent that we participate in it consciously and assist the process in this very life, to whatever degree, it's only a question of degree. And this we have to remind ourselves and affirm in every part of our being. And the more we hold that conviction the more it allows the soul's determinism and inevitability to reflect and form things in us and around us for this realization.
I just wanted to thank you, Guruji, for teaching us many tips on how we can fill the gap, we as mental beings, between ourselves and Sat, between ourselves and Chit, between ourselves and Ananda. Also, what I found very profound was how you taught us that we can allow that divine energy or consciousness to enter us, not only when we go into a sort of trance, but also in our day-to-day activities as we walk about, or we try to master a sport or master playing a musical instrument in the examples that you gave us, that we can still invite that divine energy to come into us, into our consciousness, so we master that activity. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for sharing with us these tips. Thank you.
Yes, Sri Aurobindo leads us into the knowledge and the experience. And I'm tempted to share an incident, an experience narrated by one of the old sadhikas in the ashram. So she had come here and had darshan of Sri Aurobindo at the age of 13, but she was too young to stay, though she recognized him as the master for whom she had come on earth. And so for a while she was in other places, but she had gone back with some books. And remember, this is a teenager. She's just beyond 13. And before 18. 18 is when she came back to settle in the ashram for good. And she goes back and she takes these books, and one of the books she took was The Life Divine, which most people would say is very difficult to understand. And she narrates how in the evening she would go to the top of her terrace, sit down quietly and open The Life Divine and start reading. And as she was reading, she felt as if the words were being spoken to her by this presence within, Sri Aurobindo's presence. And as she read, the whole meaning and sense of it was just revealed and just went straight inside, imprinting in her and of course changing the being. And this is the nature of the true teacher. And this is how Sri Aurobindo leads us as we read him and study him. We can end with a chant of Om together 5 times. In gratitude and in thanks to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother.